I am a philosopher. Some friends think it's odd or maybe even a little pretentious to introduce myself that way. They tell me people don't understand what that really means. So why can't you just say you're a philosophy professor or a philosophy teacher? Well, I am those things too. I've been at it for 30 years. And since I'm sure you're just dying to know how that's been going, I'll tell you a little about it. In particular, I want to tell you about a worry that once afflicted me, and also about the children's riddle that saved me from that affliction. One afternoon, long ago, just after a graduation commencement ceremony, I met a former student in the reception area who had taken my first year course and went on to study engineering or finance. I don't remember her name. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah wanted to thank me for the class and for helping her to appreciate the main lesson of philosophy. I thanked her for the kind words, and with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, I asked her to go on. What was that main lesson? I asked. You know, she said, there are no right or wrong answers. Not really. Just different perspectives on things. How odd, I thought to myself. I don't remember teaching that lesson at all, ever. Maybe Sarah had gone blank and made something up on the spot. Maybe it was a joke she had heard on South Park. Maybe she was trolling me. I don't know. I let it go. But over the years, now and then, a few other students would smile and thank me for teaching this same misbegotten lesson. And that's how my worries grew. I became slightly haunted by certain thoughts, things I didn't know. How many of my former students are thinking this way? Only a few had said so to me directly, but I imagined dozens of others, maybe more, maybe hundreds. And this worried me. Where did the misunderstanding come from? Well, I was never so naive as to imagine that students would remember details from Plato's atomic theory, for example, or from Francis Bacon's explanation of heat. Sure, forget the details, but this? It's no surprise that some prominent public figures have aimed disparaging remarks against my vocation. We need more welders and less philosophers, a U.S. senator grumbled nearly a decade ago. When I checked with other philosophers, I discovered that we could commiserate, since they too heard things like this from their former students. I was not alone. To be misremembered like this, trust me, is the philosophy professor's nightmare. I wondered if my colleagues in chemistry or physics enjoyed more satisfying appreciations from their former students. I think they do. If anything, their students would likely thank them for what they recognize as the main lesson of science. That despite a multitude of different perspectives, there are always right or wrong answers. Most scientists, I hope, will readily admit that this too is a misconception, but it's nothing they would lose any sleep over, since this is a much more respected misconception. Okay, so now that you know about the philosophy professor's nightmare, or at least one of them, I need to tell you about a children's riddle, which my own kids read to me from the back seat of the car on a road trip many years ago. This is the riddle that cured me of the philosopher's nightmare. Maybe some of you will know it. Here's the riddle. How far can the fox run into the woods? In the car on that road trip, we discussed it for a while. There were intermittent silences filled by contemplation or whatever it is that occurs when we try to think but without familiar coordinates to guide us. What fox? Which woods? Who cares? Thinking really is sometimes just a kind of waiting patiently for something to arrive, hovering between attention and neglect, between focusing and defocusing. We often have that experience when we try to remember something that we've forgotten. Can only wait. Car rolled on and the riddle remained intact. Out of exasperation or boredom, or both, someone said, maybe we ought to look to the back of the book to get the answer to the riddle. But of course, no way, I was locked in. And I increased everyone's exasperation by insisting that we should definitely not look in the back of the book, that it would be a moral failing to do so, that it would destroy everything noble and important and good in the universe. No. How far can the fox run into the woods? We crossed halfway into Oklahoma on that riddle. Maybe it was Louisiana. I can't recall. Later, back home, I began posing this same riddle to students in my first year philosophy course as the opening activity of the semester. Sometimes I wouldn't even introduce myself. I would just write it on the board and tell them I'm going to leave the room for 15 minutes, get a cup of coffee, then I'd drop a piece of chalk into someone's hand and say that when I return, I will need to see 5 answers written on the board, no duplicates. And please don't even think about getting help from your phone, your watch, your Neuralink, or whatever else. If you do this, you will destroy everything noble and good in the universe. Trust me. Talk with each other. Imagine you're on a road trip through Oklahoma or Louisiana. I'll see you in 15 minutes. When I return to the room, the energy in the class has elevated. I can feel it. This happens every time. And there are always at least 5 answers on the board. Some of these focus on the shape and size of the woods. Could the woods consist of 2 trees or even just 1? What if the woods are infinite or virtual or in a spiral form? Other ideas focus on the fox, its capacity or its motivation to run. Certainly, if the fox can't run at all, it can't run into or away from anything. Now, if the fox only dreams of running in the woods, does this still count as running in any sense? And still other ideas focus on the preposition, an inconspicuous little word tucked between the fox and the woods. Into. What does it mean to run into, not around, or against, or below, or above? This gets you close to the answer that typically appears at the back of the book, eventually, but it is most definitely not the right answer, which matters little anyways. What matters is the energy lifted in the room by a conversation that leaves clear evidence of imagination and reason and logic and language and humor at work all together. Jaron Lanier once said something simple and marvelous in an essay from 2010 entitled, "Does the Digital Classroom Enfeeble the Mind?" A quote, "If students don't learn to think," he wrote, "then no amount of access to information will do them any good." And he continued, "But if we ask what thinking is, so that we can then ask how to foster it, we encounter an astonishing and terrifying answer. We don't know." Lanier is right about this, absolutely right, but I will add this. Although no one knows exactly what thinking is, most likely because it is not exactly anything, everyone knows what it feels like to enjoy thinking. Sometimes the enjoyment comes from converging on the one best answer or the only defensible answer. And sometimes the enjoyment comes from examining the interior landscape of our own mind, what we could call thinking about thinking. And that's what the fox running into the woods can do. It can show that the tools we habitually use for thinking are tools that we can tamper with, take apart, and reassemble in new ways. This is not simply to view things from various perspectives according to one's taste or mood. It is to discover occasionally and with unpredictable degrees of clarity and consequence how some of those perspectives, which form one's sense of reality and value, are put together, and how they might be put together differently. It is to examine how specific frames of meaning may set some specific conditions on frames of truth. This sounds philosophical, abstract, or pointless. And in practice, sometimes it is pointless, but sometimes it isn't. And it's seldom possible to know in advance where these kinds of maneuvers on meaning will take you. This is what I like to call the wager of thinking philosophically. It is a gamble. And I tell my students this, tell myself this. Sometimes thinking about thinking is just getting lost in our heads pointlessly, but sometimes it changes everything. Galileo and Einstein, for example, set loose new and revolutionary possibilities for scientific insight only by carefully examining and rearranging the frames of meaning for motion and for simultaneity. And they did so by dwelling on questions that resemble children's riddles. In the best-known physics paper of the 20th century, Einstein contemplated the following question: what do we really mean when we say the train arrived at the station at 7 o'clock? Turns out that seriously persevering on this childish question alone is enough to illuminate the irresolvable break between modern physics and all earlier framings of time and space. I'm quoting science historian Peter Gallison there. A lucid and logical explanation of the special theory of relativity, starts with this question, Einstein's original. What does it really mean to say the train arrived at the station at 7 o'clock? Nearly 20 years ago, Sir Ken Robinson stood on a TED stage to explore the question whether schools kill creativity. It's the most viewed TED Talk of all time, and in it we confront the prospect and the warning that schools may push children away from creativity, not towards it, chiefly by rewarding only the correct answer, by punishing the wrong ones, and by some other nefarious practices of organized responsibility as well. To the extent that this is still occurring, and I suppose it is, the teaching and learning experiences of higher education ought to undo some of it. We educators ought to do our best to create these experiences. In schools, there are often tools, both traditional and time-tested tools like calculus or chemical titration, as well as new tools that appear with increasing speed and frequency and unpredictability. Benjamin Franklin often gets credit for the insight that human beings are not just tool users. We are essentially tool makers. And therein lies a critical difference. Setting aside the importance of right and wrong answers, or even solutions to problems, we ought to take seriously Ben Franklin's canny observation. And we can do this by creating invitations to enjoy the activity of making tools for thinking. We can try to make these invitations irresistible, and we should extend these invitations not only to our students, but also to ourselves. We have to acknowledge a significant update to Ben Franklin's 18th century insight, because we find now that we are machine makers. And we are ever more confronted with the strange and unforeseen consequences of this. Of course, we have been machine makers for a long time, but some new machines have been loosed upon us. Information machines of immense scope and power. Machines that are said to learn and to be able to help others to learn, both other machines and human beings. It is unclear how the goals of those who design, own, supervise, and profit from these information networks will alter the means and ends of education. I expect the day will come when someone does ask me how I intend to compete with Socrates' GTP. Maybe it will be someone on a bench in a train station who asked me that. Maybe it will be my boss. Maybe it will be yours. Before I have to take this on as my new worry, my new philosopher's nightmare, I hope to hear from a few more former students who take a moment to thank me for the class and the main lesson of philosophy. What's that? I'll ask them. Let's see. It has something to do with a fox and the woods, right? Right. Thank you very much.